Alright, welcome back. Lights down. Phone on Do Not Disturb. Brain halfway in dreamland. Perfect. Because tonight's little bedtime history detour is about something that's, let's just say, not on your average funeral playlist. We're drifting far away from marble cathedrals and velvet-draped caskets. No powdered wigs or organ music here. Instead, imagine the green hush of the Amazon or the silent highlands of Papua New Guinea. Somewhere in that deep tangle of trees and mist, a group gathers around the fire, not to bury the dead, but to eat them. Yes, tonight we're tucking ourselves in with the story of cannibal funerals. Because apparently, for a few ancient, and not so ancient communities, the kindest thing you could do for grandma wasn't a bouquet of lilies. It was, well, lunch. Now, before your brain goes straight to the horror movie version of events, people with skull necklaces and wild eyes, slow down. These weren't chaotic feasts of savagery. They were quiet, structured, and deeply emotional acts of reverence. In certain tribes across Melanesia, the Amazon, and even parts of Africa, eating the dead wasn't about violence. It was about love, a kind of final communion between the living and the lost. In the Amazon basin, for instance, the Wari people practiced something called endocannibalism. Yes, there's a word for it, meaning they consumed members of their own community after death. When someone died, their body wasn't left to rot alone or buried in the earth, where worms and insects would devour it. Instead, their kin would gather, weep, sing, and cook the flesh over a gentle fire. Then, with solemnity, they'd eat small portions. It sounds shocking now, but in their worldview, letting worms consume your loved one was far more disturbing than eating them yourself. To them, it was an act of mercy, a way to ensure that the person's spirit was not abandoned to decay, but instead carried within those who loved them most. Because if you think about it, morbid as it sounds, what's more intimate than becoming part of the people who remember you? It's basically the ultimate you are what you eat situation. Let's float over to Papua New Guinea for a moment. Here, among the 4 people in the Eastern Highlands, the same idea took root, but with a tragic twist. Their funeral feasts were lovingly prepared, women and children typically consuming the brain and other soft tissues. And it all might have continued unnoticed, if not for a neurological epidemic that started to spread through the community. They called it kuru, which roughly translates to the shaking. At first, no one connected the dots. People began trembling uncontrollably, losing their balance, their ability to speak, eventually dying in slow, terrifying decline. It took years before scientists realized what was happening. Kuru was being transmitted through prion misfolded proteins, passed along when people ate infected brain tissue. So yes, the world's first known prion epidemic came from an act of love. The women were the primary victims, because they were the ones most involved in these funerals. They didn't do it out of hunger or cruelty, but devotion. To them, it was a sacred ritual that bound families together even beyond death. It's one of those dark ironies of history, how something meant to honor the dead ended up quietly destroying the living. But cannibal funerals weren't limited to the tropics. In parts of ancient Tibet and Mongolia, there's evidence of a different approach, one that sounds more poetic if equally strange. When food was scarce and ground too frozen for burial, monks and villagers practiced what's called sky burial. They'd leave the body on a mountain ledge to be consumed by vultures. In their eyes, it was a cosmic recycling program, the flesh returning to the sky through another living being. You could argue that's just another form of ritual consumption, just outsourced to the birds. Humans, it seems, have always been deeply concerned with what happens to bodies after death. We like to pretend we're above it all now with our sealed coffins and polished marble, but if you look at the history of death rituals globally, it's just a constant question of who eats whom. Even in parts of South America, Jesuit missionaries recorded stories of ritual cannibalism among tribes that believed consuming the dead preserved their essence. One 17th century missionary, Father Antonio Vieira, described how mourners spoke to the body as if it could still hear. "Now you will live within us," they said, before roasting portions of the flesh over embers. He, of course, was horrified. Europe in the 1600s was very big on judgment, but the people saw nothing grotesque in it. To them, it was tenderness with teeth. There's something oddly peaceful about that. No denial of death. No pretense that the body is sacred marble. Just an acceptance that life and death feed into each other, quite literally. We like to imagine civilization drew a hard line between the living and the dead. But even in Europe, that's not entirely true. Let's not forget medicinal cannibalism, which, yes, was a thing. Up until the 18th century, European apothecaries sold powdered mummy, actual human remains, believed to cure everything from epilepsy to headaches. Doctors prescribed mummy powder, human fat ointments, and skull tinctures. Kings and nobles, ever the trend followers, drank concoctions made from human remains to preserve their health. So before you side-eye the wary or the four tribes, remember, early modern Europeans were basically making smoothies out of corpses. The only difference is they wore wigs while doing it. Let's just pause on that thought as we exhale. The way people treat their dead has always reflected how they understand life. For some, it's about separation, keeping death as far away as possible. For others, it's about inclusion, making sure the dead remain close, quite literally inside them. Maybe it's unsettling, maybe it's strangely comforting. Either way, it tells us something deep and quiet about the human condition, that even when faced with decay, we crave connection more than anything. Let's drift deeper into that thought in part 2, where we'll explore a few more cultures that didn't see cannibal funerals as taboo, but as the ultimate act of remembrance. Alright, still awake? Barely? Perfect. That's exactly the right state of mind for this next bit. Let's sink a little deeper now, past the flickering campfires of the Amazon and the mountain winds of Papua New Guinea, into the quieter corners of ritual and belief. Because while the word cannibal makes most people flinch in much of human history, it wasn't a sign of barbarity. It was a language of love. And honestly, the more you look into it, the more it starts to make sense. In that slightly unsettling, oh humanity, you're weird sort of way. Let's start with the Yanomami of the Brazil-Venezuela border, one of the last major groups to keep fragments of endo-cannibal traditions alive into the 20th century. When a member of the community died, the Yanomami didn't bury the body or leave it behind. Instead, they built a small fire and carefully roasted the remains. Yes, all of them. But they didn't eat them right away. They collected the ashes, mixed them with banana soup, and then drank them. Every family member took a sip. Even the children. It wasn't morbid, it was comforting. They believed the soul needed to be fully absorbed by the living before it could rest. If even a single fragment of the body went uneaten or unburned, the spirit would wander, lonely and unfinished. It's one of those moments where death and intimacy blur until they're indistinguishable. A kind of emotional recycling that modern society could never quite stomach, literally or figuratively. If we drift west, across the Pacific, we find another version of this in Fiji, where cannibalism had a distinctly political flavor. Fijians weren't just known for eating enemies, though yes, that happened, but they also practiced honorary consumption in rare funerary contexts. Chiefs might have their remains ritually shared by close kin or retainers. To the Fijians, this wasn't about cruelty. It was about mana, spiritual power. Eating a part of someone great was like inheriting their strength. You didn't want that energy fading into the soil. You wanted it in you. Of course, the British missionaries who arrived in the 1800s didn't exactly love that idea. They called it savage, banned it, and then wondered why no one took them seriously while they drank tea made with sugar produced by slave labor. But that's another bedtime story. Back on the South American side, there's a quiet echo of these rituals among the Amahuaca and other forest peoples. Anthropologists noted that after cremation, families would sometimes mix ashes into chicha, a fermented maize drink, and share it in a calm, ceremonial meal. You can imagine it. Soft jungle light, birds overhead, smoke curling upward through palm leaves, people sitting together in silence. Not mourning exactly, more like communion. A peaceful acknowledgement that someone's gone, but not entirely. And that's something we tend to forget in the modern world, where death is hidden behind hospital curtains, and grief is meant to be tidy and private. For these tribes, grief was communal. It was physical. You didn't just cry. You consumed your loss, piece by piece, until it became part of you again. Now, if all this still sounds too grim for bedtime, don't worry. You're not alone. Even some ancient cultures who didn't literally eat their dead had similar symbolic versions of the ritual. Take the Tibetan sky burials we mentioned earlier. The body is offered to vultures, nature's cleanup crew, as an act of generosity. In Buddhist thought, the body is just a vessel, so feeding it to another life form isn't desecration. It's merit. It's a softer form of the same principle, turning death into sustenance and loss into continuity. The only real difference is who does the eating. And then, of course, there's Europe again, our favorite hypocritical continent, where moral panic about primitive cannibalism went hand in hand with drinking powdered skulls for health. In the 1600s, the British physician Thomas Willis recommended a medicine made from human skulls soaked in wine. He swore it worked wonders for epilepsy. Meanwhile, executioners across Germany sold human fat as a miracle balm. The so-called mellified man, a mythic corpse preserved in honey, was said to cure all ills if you consumed a spoonful. So yes, even as European scholars clutched their pearls about savage tribes, they were essentially running a ghost-themed smoothie bar. History's funny like that. The difference between medicine and ritual often depends on who's holding the fork. At its core, endocannibalism and all its strange cousins reveals something kind of beautiful about the human condition. We hate endings. We hate the idea that love or memory just stops. So we invent ways to keep it going. For some, that means lighting candles, building tombs, or praying. For others, it meant stirring a little ash into soup. Different ingredients, same emotion. If you zoom out far enough, you start to see a pattern that's not about cannibalism at all, it's about connection. About the refusal to let death be an absolute wall. Because really, what's the point of human history if not one long series of attempts to avoid saying goodbye? We preserve bodies, mummify kings, build marble cathedrals, carve names into stones. Every ritual is just another way of whispering, stay with us a little longer. And in that sense, the Wari, the Four, the Yanomami, they weren't monsters. They were just human. Uncomfortably, beautifully human. So as we drift off tonight, maybe that's the thought to keep. That for all our progress, we're not so different from the people who once sat beneath the trees, sharing a final meal in the name of love. Sleep well. And maybe, just maybe, don't think too hard about what's in the soup.